Did medieval women have a say in their own lives? Was marriage always a grim sentence? The era spanning from the 5th to the 15th century often feels distant, shrouded in assumptions. But what if many of the things we believe about women and marriage from that time are completely, utterly wrong? Number 8. The idea that every medieval woman lived a short, harsh life is a tale that does not hold up to scrutiny. The picture often painted of medieval life suggests a constant struggle against disease, famine, and violence, leading to universally short lifespans, especially for women burdened by endless childbirth. This common assumption makes it seem as though most women barely made it past their 20s or 30s, dying in labor or succumbing to the harsh realities of daily existence. However, digging into historical records and archaeological findings reveals a more nuanced and, in some cases, surprisingly resilient reality for many medieval women. The notion that all women lived a short, brutal existence does not capture the full tapestry of their experiences. For instance, looking at skeletal remains from various medieval cemeteries across Europe provides a fascinating glimpse into actual lifespans. While infant and child mortality rates were indeed tragically high, those who survived into adulthood often lived for many more decades. It was not uncommon to find women who lived into their 50s, 60s, and even 70s, especially among the more prosperous classes, but also among some segments of the peasantry. Of course, the threat of childbirth was a serious danger. Maternal mortality was a significant concern for women throughout their reproductive years, yet it did not mean every pregnancy was fatal, nor that a woman's life ended with her first or second child. Many women bore multiple children and continued to live long, productive lives, raising families and contributing to their communities. Consider the role of women in the agricultural backbone of medieval society. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields, sowing, harvesting, and managing livestock. They possessed an intimate knowledge of the land, its cycles, and the necessities of sustenance. This demanding physical labor, while arduous, also spoke to a certain robustness and adaptability. These women were not fragile beings constantly on the brink of collapse. They were integral to the survival of their families and villages, performing tasks essential for food production and storage. Their contributions were not merely confined to the domestic sphere, they extended into the very fabric of the economy and community life. Furthermore, medieval women engaged in a vast array of skilled trades and crafts. In towns and cities, women ran businesses, often alongside their husbands or independently as widows. And they were brewers, bakers, textile workers, innkeepers, apothecaries, and even scribes. For example, records from cities like London and Paris show countless women actively participating in guilds, operating shops, and engaging in commerce. These economic activities suggest a level of stability and a potential for longevity that contradicts the image of universally short, brutish lives. A woman managing an alehouse or weaving fine cloth needed a certain level of health and sustained energy to perform her duties day in and day out. Her daily routine was far from a perpetual struggle for mere survival. The health of medieval women was also influenced by factors beyond just disease and childbirth. Dietary variations played a large role. While famine was a periodic threat, access to a consistent, if simple, diet of grains, vegetables, and sometimes meat or fish could sustain a person for many years. Women in wealthier households certainly enjoyed better nutrition and living conditions, which contributed to longer lives. But even among the less affluent, regional differences in food availability and agricultural practices meant that not every woman faced the same dire circumstances. Some areas were more fertile, some communities had better access to trade routes, and these factors could impact overall health and longevity. The idea of women being constantly pregnant and dying young also overlooks the various forms of contraception and abortion practices that existed, even if rudimentary and often dangerous. While not openly discussed or sanctioned by the church, historical documents and folklore hint at knowledge of herbs and methods used to prevent or terminate pregnancies. These practices, however crude, suggest that women were not simply passive vessels for childbearing, and that they sometimes sought to exert some control over their reproductive lives, which could, in turn, influence their long-term health and survival. Moreover, the status of elderly women in medieval society was often one of respect and authority. A woman who had lived a long life, raised a family, and perhaps managed a household or business often became a matriarch, a repository of wisdom and experience. She might advise younger women, teach skills, or even hold a position of influence within her family or village. These roles imply a societal recognition of female longevity and continued contribution, rather than a narrative of inevitable early decline. The image of A wise old woman, whether a village elder or a revered abbess, appears in medieval literature and historical accounts, challenging the idea that old age was a rarity for women. The focus on mortality rates, while important, sometimes overshadows the daily resilience and adaptive capacities of medieval women. They developed remedies for common ailments, understood the healing properties of plants, and often served as primary caregivers within their families and communities. This practical medical knowledge, passed down through generations, would have contributed to the overall health and survival of many, including themselves. Their lives were undoubtedly challenging by modern standards, marked by hard work and vulnerability to disease. However, it is an oversimplification to assume that every woman's existence was universally short, brutal, and devoid of moments of stability or even prosperity. The variations in social status, geographic location, and individual circumstances paint a far more complex picture of medieval female longevity than the common outdated belief suggests. Number 7. The story of chivalry protecting all women is a myth that needs to be unraveled. When someone mentions medieval chivalry, an image might spring to mind: a brave knight on a noble steed, defending damsels in distress, always courteous and respectful to all women. This romanticized view, largely shaped by later literature and Victorian interpretations, suggests a universal code of conduct that safeguarded women from harm and ensured their respectful treatment. However, the historical reality of chivalry was far more complex and often applied to a very specific group of women, leaving the vast majority outside its protective embrace. The idea that chivalry offered universal protection to all women is a charming but inaccurate simplification. Chivalry, at its core, was a code of conduct primarily developed for the knightly class, a set of ideals intended to govern the behavior of noble warriors. It emphasized virtues such as courage, honor, loyalty, and courtesy. When it came to women, the code largely focused on how knights should treat noblewomen, particularly those of their own social standing or those of their lords and ladies. This focus was less about universal respect for womanhood and more about maintaining social order, demonstrating elite status, and upholding the honor of noble families. A knight's courtesy towards a lady was often a public display of his refinement and his adherence to the values of his class, rather than an automatic extension of protection to every female he encountered. Consider the role of courtly love, an integral part of the chivalric ideal. Courtly love often depicted a knight's idealized devotion to a married noblewoman, a love that was typically unconsummated and expressed through poetic verse, acts of bravery, and service. While this celebrated the lady as an object of adoration, it was not about empowering women generally. It was a sophisticated game played within aristocratic circles, reinforcing the social hierarchy and the specific roles of noblemen and women. The damsel in distress needing rescue was almost always a noblewoman, whose capture or plight reflected poorly on the men who were supposed to protect her family's honor and property. The concept did not extend to a peasant woman facing hardship or violence in the fields. Indeed, the vast majority of medieval women, the commoners, peasants, and townswomen, lived lives largely untouched by the formal ideals of chivalry. They were not the subjects of grand romantic gestures or the beneficiaries of a knight's vow to protect the weak. For a peasant woman, the realities of life involved hard labor, vulnerability to famine, disease, and the whims of her lord. A knight riding through a village was more likely to be collecting taxes or requisitioning supplies than offering protection. The code of chivalry did not compel him to intervene if a peasant woman was being exploited or abused, especially if the perpetrator was another commoner or even his own lord. The violence inherent in medieval society also challenges the widespread protective image of chivalry. Warfare, banditry, and local feuds were common, and these often led to devastating consequences for ordinary people. When armies marched through the countryside, women of all social classes were vulnerable to robbery, assault, and abduction. Chivalry's rules about warfare often applied to how knights treated other knights or noble prisoners, not to the general civilian population, and certainly not specifically to peasant women. Chroniclers of the period recount instances of widespread depredations by soldiers against non-combatants, including women, showing a stark contrast to the idealized image of a universally protective knight. Furthermore, the very structure of medieval society often placed women in positions of vulnerability, even within their own households. And legal systems, while varying, often favored men, and domestic violence was not uncommon. A knight's code of honor did not necessarily prevent him from mistreating his own wife or female servants, especially if they were of a lower status. The protection offered by chivalry was conditional, often limited to women within the knight's own social circle, and often based on whether a woman's honor was tied to a powerful man's reputation. Consider the portrayal of women in popular medieval literature and historical accounts. While some narratives celebrated virtuous and noble ladies, many also depicted women as temptations, seductresses, or objects to be won and controlled. This dual portrayal indicates that the respect supposedly inherent in chivalry was not uniformly applied or deeply ingrained in all social interactions. The idealized image of the lady was often a construct that served to define masculine ideals, rather than a reflection of true female agency or universal protection. The concept of chivalry was also a dynamic and evolving ideal, often more prescriptive than descriptive. It represented what society, or at least the aristocratic elite, aspired to be rather than a consistent reality. Knights often failed to live up to their own ideals, driven by ambition, greed, or personal vendettas. The good knight, who protected all women, was an archetype, a moral benchmark, rather than a universal truth about the behavior of all medieval warriors. The stories of knights protecting damsels were often cautionary tales or moral lessons, designed to teach noble young men how they should behave, rather than factual accounts of everyday interactions. So, while the idea of a knight riding to the rescue of any woman in distress is a comforting one, historical records demonstrate that the reach of chivalry was quite limited. It primarily focused on the social interactions within the nobility, defining appropriate behavior for aristocratic men towards aristocratic women. For the vast majority of medieval women, their safety and well-being depended on the practicalities of their local communities, the strength of their families, and sometimes their own resourcefulness, rather than the idealized, selective code of chivalry. The romanticized image does not capture the harsh and often unprotected realities faced by most women in the medieval period. Number 6. The belief that medieval women were universally uneducated is a narrative that ignores surprising facts. A widely held perception about medieval women suggests that they were largely illiterate and uneducated, confined to domestic chores or manual labor, with no access to formal learning. This narrative often portrays them as entirely unlettered, their minds untrained, and their intellectual horizons limited to the confines of their homes. While widespread formal schooling for women as we understand it today was indeed uncommon, particularly for the vast majority of the population, historical evidence reveals a much more varied and often surprising landscape of female literacy and education. The idea that medieval women were universally uneducated is a sweeping generalization that overlooks significant pockets of learning and intellectual activity among them. One of the most notable exceptions to this generalization can be found within the walls of convents and monasteries. For women who chose a religious life, the convent offered a unique opportunity for intellectual development and scholarly pursuits. Many convents were centers of learning, where nuns were taught to read and write, often in Latin, the language of scholarship and theology. They copied manuscripts, created illuminated texts, composed music, wrote chronicles, and studied theology and philosophy. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, composer, philosopher, mystic, and polymath, stand as powerful testaments to the intellectual achievements possible for women in the medieval period. She wrote extensively on theology, natural science, and medicine, and her works were widely read and respected. Convents provided not just spiritual refuge, but also intellectual havens for women seeking knowledge and literacy. Beyond the cloister, noblewomen also received a form of education, albeit one tailored to their social standing and future roles. While they might not have attended universities, which were exclusively male, they were often educated at home by tutors, chaplains, or learned members of their households. This education typically included reading and writing, often in multiple languages, such as Latin, French, and their native tongue. They learned history, literature, music, and sometimes practical skills like estate management, household administration, and basic arithmetic. A noblewoman was expected to manage a large household, oversee servants, and potentially even administer estates in her husband's absence. Such responsibilities required a significant degree of literacy and administrative skill. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, was known for her cultured court, her patronage of troubadours, and her intellectual engagement, indicating a high level of personal education and appreciation for learning. Consider also the influential figure of Christine de Pizan, a 14th to 15th century writer and intellectual who is often considered Europe's first professional female author. Widowed young, she supported her family through her writing, producing a remarkable body of work that included poetry, biographies, and political and philosophical treatises. Her famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, argues for the intellectual and moral capabilities of women, drawing on historical and mythological examples of accomplished women. Christine de Pisan's very existence, her prolific output, and the respect she garnered in intellectual circles directly contradict the idea of universal female illiteracy and lack of education. Her work shows that some women were not only educated but also actively contributed to the intellectual discourse of their time. Even among urban commoners, a surprising degree of literacy existed for some women, particularly those involved in commerce. A merchant's wife, for example, often played an active role in the family business. She might manage accounts, correspond with suppliers or customers, or even run the shop in her husband's absence. These tasks necessitated at least basic literacy and numeracy. Records from medieval towns show women as innkeepers, shopkeepers, and craftswomen who needed to be able to read orders, write receipts, and keep ledgers. While not a formal education in the modern sense, this practical literacy was essential for their economic participation in daily lives. The widespread availability of religious texts in vernacular languages, especially in the later Middle Ages, also contributed to female literacy. Devotional books, saints' lives, and translations of the Bible allowed women to engage with religious texts directly, encouraging reading skills for spiritual purposes. Many women were taught to read specifically so they could understand and engage with these texts, sometimes at home or through local parish instruction. While writing might have been a less common skill, the ability to read was more widespread than often assumed, particularly in households that could afford books or where piety was highly valued. Of course, it is important to remember that the majority of the population, male and female, peasant and urban laborer, was indeed illiterate. Formal education was a privilege. However, the blanket statement that medieval women were universally uneducated or illiterate ignores the significant contributions of female scholars, the intellectual environments of convents, the practical literacy of urban businesswomen, and the learned aristocratic women who shaped courts and cultural life. Their stories offer a vital counter-narrative, revealing that while opportunities for formal education were limited, many medieval women found avenues for learning and intellectual growth that defy the narrow confines of common stereotypes. They were not just passive recipients of knowledge, many were active learners, patrons, and creators within their own intellectual spheres. Number 5. The notion that divorce was impossible for medieval women simply misses the complex truth. The common understanding often holds that once a medieval couple was married, they were bound for life, with no possibility of escape. The powerful influence of the Church, which viewed marriage as a sacred sacrament, is frequently cited as the reason for this absolute permanence, leading to the belief that divorce, as we know it today, was entirely non-existent. While it is true that outright divorce, allowing for remarriage, was not recognized by the medieval church, the reality for medieval women seeking to end a marriage was far more intricate than a simple no. There were specific legal mechanisms, primarily annulment and separation, that offered avenues for women to escape a marital bond, though these processes were often challenging and costly. The idea that divorce was utterly impossible misses the nuanced legal landscape and the resourceful efforts of women to navigate it. The most significant legal avenue for ending a marriage in the medieval period was an annulment. Unlike a modern divorce, an annulment declared that the marriage had never been valid in the first place, meaning it was null and void from the beginning. This was a crucial distinction because it did not break a sacred bond, it merely recognized that such a bond had never truly existed due to some impediment. If an annulment was granted, both parties were free to remarry, as if they had never been married. For women, this offered a pathway out of a marriage that could be oppressive, barren, or politically undesirable. There were several grounds upon which an annulment could be sought, and women often skillfully used these to their advantage. One common ground was consanguinity, meaning the couple was too closely related by blood or affinity relationship through marriage. The Church's definition of kinship was extremely broad, extending to many degrees of relationship, and it was often difficult for even high-born couples to prove they were entirely unrelated. Powerful families, especially, sometimes used this rule to dissolve alliances that were no longer politically convenient. For a woman, discovering a hidden family connection, or having her family discover one, could provide a legitimate reason for annulment. Another significant ground was pre-contract. If one of the parties had previously made a binding promise to marry someone else, even if not formally solemnized, it could invalidate a later marriage. Proving a pre-contract was often challenging, requiring witnesses, but it was a potential route for women seeking an annulment. Furthermore, lack of proper consent was another valid reason. While noblewomen were often pressured into marriages, the Church insisted that free consent was a prerequisite for a valid marriage. If a woman could demonstrate, perhaps through coercion or extreme duress, that she had not truly consented, an annulment might be granted. This was a difficult argument to make, but not an impossible one, particularly in cases of child marriage or overt threats. Non-consummation of the marriage was also a legitimate ground for annulment. If the marriage could not be consummated due to impotence or refusal, it could be deemed invalid. This was a private and often embarrassing matter, but it was a path that some women took if their husbands were unable or unwilling to fulfill this aspect of the marital union. Similarly, a lack of capacity to marry, such as one party being too young or mentally incapacitated, could also lead to an annulment. Consider the famous case of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France was annulled on grounds of consanguinity. While political expediency certainly played a significant role, the legal mechanism employed was an annulment, not a modern divorce. This demonstrates that, even at the highest levels of medieval society, an existing marriage could be legally dissolved, allowing the parties to remarry, as Eleanor famously did with Henry Plantagenet, who later became King of England. Her case, while exceptional in its political ramifications, illustrates the legal pathway that existed. Beyond annulment, legal separations a mensa et thoro from bed and board were also possible. This meant that the couple would live apart, but they remained legally married and could not remarry. These separations were often granted on grounds of extreme cruelty, adultery, or prolonged desertion. While not offering complete freedom to remarry, a legal separation provided a woman with an escape from a dangerous or unbearable living situation, granting her financial support, alimony, and protection from her husband. For many women in abusive or intolerable marriages, this was a vital, if not ideal, option. The process for obtaining an annulment or separation was handled by ecclesiastical courts, meaning they were church courts. These proceedings could be lengthy, expensive, and require significant evidence and legal maneuvering. Access to these processes was often easier for the wealthy and well-connected, who could afford legal representation and influence. However, records from these courts show that women from various social strata, though perhaps less frequently, did bring cases, demonstrating their agency in seeking relief from their marital bonds. The existence of these legal mechanisms, however imperfect or difficult to access, directly refutes the blanket statement that divorce was impossible. So, while the medieval church did not permit divorce in the modern sense, the existence of annulments and legal separations provided significant, albeit challenging, avenues for women to dissolve or escape their marriages. These were not easy routes, and they required navigating a complex legal and social system. However, for those women who successfully pursued them, these legal processes offered a means to end a marriage, and in the case of annulment, even to remarry, demonstrating that the medieval marital landscape was far more flexible than often assumed. The assumption of absolute and unbreakable marital bonds does not fully capture the strategic efforts women made to regain their freedom and shape their own lives. Number 4. The assumption that medieval women possessed no economic influence is a historical misunderstanding waiting to be corrected. The traditional image of medieval women often places them solely within the domestic sphere, managing a household but devoid of any real economic power or influence. They are seen as dependents, excluded from the bustling marketplaces and guild halls that define medieval commerce. This limited view suggests that all wealth and economic decision-making rested firmly in the hands of men. However, a deeper look into medieval society reveals a vibrant and diverse participation of women in various economic sectors, demonstrating that they held surprising levels of financial agency and played crucial roles in the medieval economy, both within and beyond the confines of their homes. The assumption of medieval women's economic powerlessness is a profound misreading of historical evidence. One of the most striking examples of women's economic influence can be found in the urban centers. In towns and cities, women were active participants in a wide array of trades and crafts. They were not merely assistants to their husbands, many were skilled artisans in their own right. Women worked as brewers, bakers, textile producers, embroiderers, innkeepers, apothecaries, and even scribes. Records from medieval guilds, which regulated trades, often show that women were full members, especially as widows or as wives who were partners in their husbands' businesses. For instance, in London, there are numerous accounts of women running successful brewing businesses, providing a staple drink to the city's population. These women managed supply chains, hired labor, and handled finances, exercising significant economic control. The textile industry, in particular, was a major source of employment and economic power for women. From spinning and weaving to dyeing and tailoring, women dominated many aspects of cloth production. They often worked from their homes, contributing directly to the family income, or they might work in workshops. The income generated from these activities was crucial for the survival and prosperity of many households. This was not simply a secondary income for many families. The earnings of the women were foundational to their economic stability. Beyond specific trades, many married women, especially in urban areas, acted as de facto business partners with their husbands. While legal doctrines like coverture in some areas of common law limited a married woman's independent legal identity and practice, a merchant's wife was often indispensable to his enterprise. She might manage the shop in his absence, keep accounts, deal with customers, and even negotiate transactions. She was an active participant in the economic life of the family unit, making decisions that directly impacted their financial well being. These women were not just homemakers, they were entrepreneurs and vital contributors to family wealth. The widows, in particular, often enjoyed significant economic autonomy. Upon the death of their husbands, widows frequently inherited their businesses, property, and dower rights, a portion of their husband's estate, typically one-third, reserved for their support. With their dower and inherited assets, widows could continue to operate the family business, invest in new ventures, or manage their own estates. Many became prominent figures in their communities, exercising considerable economic leverage. This highlights that while marriage might have sometimes curtailed a woman's individual legal standing, widowhood could grant her a powerful economic position, allowing her to be an independent economic agent. Even in rural areas, peasant women played vital economic roles that often go unrecognized. They were involved in farming, gardening, animal husbandry, and food processing. They managed household resources, preserved food, produced textiles for the family's use, and often brought goods to local markets to sell. Their labor was essential for the family's survival and economic output. While not accumulating vast wealth, their contributions were fundamental to the agrarian economy and represented a form of economic power within their limited sphere. The management of the household economy, which included budgeting, resource allocation, and production for consumption or sale, was a complex task that fell largely to women and required significant skill and foresight. The concept of pin money also illustrates a certain degree of economic agency for women. This was a small allowance or income that a wife might have for her personal spending, often for items like pins, ribbons, or small luxuries. While seemingly minor, its existence points to the recognition of a wife's need for some independent financial control, separate from the main household budget. This small degree of financial autonomy, however limited, showed that women were not simply passive recipients of funds but had their own spending power. Furthermore, noblewomen and queens often wielded immense economic power. They managed vast estates, collected rents, oversaw numerous servants, and controlled significant financial resources. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Isabella of France managed their own finances, commissioned building projects, and patronized arts and crafts on a grand scale, influencing the economy through their spending and investment. Their economic decisions could impact entire regions and industries. So, the notion that medieval women lacked economic influence is far from accurate. From running thriving businesses in bustling cities and contributing vital labor in agricultural communities to managing vast noble estates and leveraging their dower rights as widows, women were deeply embedded in and actively shaped the medieval economy. Their contributions were diverse, essential, and often financially significant, challenging the outdated belief of their universal economic powerlessness. Their economic agency was a vital, often overlooked aspect of their lives. Number 3. The common thought that love played no part in medieval marriage overlooks intriguing evidence. A persistent myth about medieval marriages suggests that they were purely transactional affairs, driven by economic interests, political alliances, and social status, with affection, romance, or love having absolutely no role to play. This view paints a picture of grim, loveless unions where individuals, particularly women, were merely pawns in a larger game of power and property. While it is true that practical considerations often outweighed romantic notions in the formation of marriages, especially among the aristocracy, dismissing the role of love entirely in medieval matrimony is an oversimplification that ignores compelling evidence of affection, companionship, and even passion within these unions. The idea that love was completely absent from medieval marriage is a notion that misses a complex truth. For the nobility and royalty, marriage was indeed a strategic alliance. A union between two powerful families could secure land, strengthen political ties, and produce heirs to continue a dynasty. In these circles, personal preference often took a backseat to dynastic imperatives. While young noblewomen, sometimes even as children, were betrothed to ensure advantageous matches. However, even within these arranged marriages, affection and companionship could develop over time. Living together, sharing common goals, and raising children often fostered bonds of genuine affection. Letters exchanged between spouses, such as those found in the Paston Letters, a collection of correspondence from a prominent English family in the 15th century, reveal warmth, concern, and even longing between husbands and wives. Agnes Paston, for example, frequently wrote to her husband John about family matters, expressing worries about his health and safety, indicating a deep personal connection beyond mere duty. The very concept of courtly love, which flourished in aristocratic circles from the 12th century onwards, while often separate from the institution of marriage, suggests that the medieval mind was fully capable of conceptualizing and valuing passionate love. Courtly love celebrated idealized, often illicit romantic devotion, usually between a knight and a married noblewoman. While distinct from marital love, its pervasive presence in literature and aristocratic culture shows that love, desire, and emotional connection were certainly part of the cultural consciousness. It might have even influenced how some couples perceived their own relationships, seeking to cultivate a form of affection within their arranged unions. Stories of knights performing heroic deeds in the name of a lady, even if a literary construct, speak to a societal understanding of profound emotional attachment. For commoners and peasants, marriages were often arranged by families, but with different considerations. The economic viability was still paramount. Marrying a neighbor could consolidate land, provide labor, or strengthen community ties. However, among these less powerful groups, there was often more room for personal choice and affection to play a role. And young men and women often met at village gatherings, during communal labor, or at markets. Now, they might have had opportunities to develop acquaintances or even affections before a formal proposal was made. While parental approval was still important, the lack of vast dynastic stakes meant that outright coercion might have been less common than among the elite. Folk songs and tales from the period sometimes hint at premarital courtship and the importance of mutual liking, suggesting that love, or at least strong attraction, was a factor for some. The church, surprisingly, also played a role in validating love as a component of marriage, albeit implicitly. The canon law, which governed marriage, stipulated that consent was essential for a valid union. While parental pressure was immense, particularly for noblewomen, the church's emphasis on free consent, even if often disregarded in practice, suggested that a marriage forced against one's will was, technically, invalid. This legal framework, however difficult to leverage, provided a theoretical space for individual choice and genuine inclination to matter. The stories of runaway couples, or those who elope to marry secretly before their parents could intervene, illustrate that some individuals sought to follow their hearts, even against formidable social barriers. Moreover, the marital manuals and religious texts of the time, while emphasizing duties and procreation, also sometimes spoke of companionship and mutual respect as cornerstones of a good marriage. They encouraged husbands and wives to live in harmony, to support each other, and to share their lives. While not explicitly defining this as romantic love in the modern sense, it certainly encompassed affection and a deep personal bond that went beyond mere utility. The domestic sphere, the shared upbringing of children, and the challenges of daily life often forged strong, enduring relationships between spouses. Historical records, such as wills, sometimes reveal a spouse's deep affection for their partner, leaving them special provisions or expressing emotional sentiments beyond mere legal obligation. A will might contain phrases expressing love and goodwill or desire for the spouse's comfort and welfare, demonstrating a personal attachment that belies the notion of a completely loveless union. These small glimpses into personal lives offer a window into the emotional realities of medieval marriages. So, while medieval marriage was undoubtedly a practical institution driven by social, economic, and political considerations, to claim that love played no part is a significant overstatement. Affection, companionship, and sometimes even passionate attachment were present, sometimes developing within arranged unions, sometimes preceding them, and always adding a layer of human complexity to the marital bond. The evidence from letters, literature, and social practices reveals that medieval men and women, like people in any era, were capable of forming deep emotional connections within their marriages, challenging the popular misconception of universally grim and loveless unions. Number 2. The notion that all medieval marriages were forced is a simplification that historical accounts challenge. The widespread image of medieval marriage often conjures up scenes of young noblewomen, barely out of childhood, being ruthlessly coerced into unions with older, undesirable men for the sole purpose of political alliance or economic gain. This stereotype leads to the common belief that all medieval marriages, especially for women, were forced, leaving no room for personal choice or desire. While it is undeniable that arranged marriages were prevalent, particularly among the elite, and parental influence was significant across all social strata, the historical reality is far more nuanced. The notion that all medieval marriages were forced is a sweeping generalization that ignores the complexities of consent, social class differences, and the very real instances of agency that existed for medieval women. For the aristocracy and royalty, marriage was indeed a critical tool for consolidating power, securing territory, and forging alliances. Daughters were valuable assets in this high-stakes game, and their marriages were meticulously planned, often from their infancy. Personal inclination rarely factored into these strategic unions. A noblewoman might be betrothed to a foreign prince she had never met, or to a powerful lord much older than herself. In these cases, the pressure from her family could be immense, bordering on outright coercion, as the family's honor and future depended on her compliance. The expectation was that she would perform her duty, regardless of her personal feelings. This type of marriage certainly felt forced to many, and historical accounts provide poignant examples of young women sent far from home to fulfill such roles. However, even within the elite, the Church's canon law stated that a marriage was only valid if both parties freely consented. While this ideal was frequently overridden by social pressure and parental authority, it provided a theoretical ground for objection. Stories exist of noblewomen who actively resisted undesirable matches, sometimes through dramatic means such as feigning illness, appealing to church authorities, or even attempting to elope. While often unsuccessful, these instances show that the concept of individual consent, however limited in practice, was present and sometimes invoked. A forced marriage could technically be annulled by the church if lack of consent could be proven, though this was a difficult and often high-stakes endeavor. Moving down the social ladder, the picture changes significantly. For commoners, peasants, and townspeople, marriages were still often arranged by parents, but the motivations and degree of coercion were different. The economic considerations were paramount. A marriage might unite two plots of land, provide extra labor for a farm, or connect families within a village. However, for these groups, personal compatibility and mutual liking often played a more significant role than for the elite. And young people in villages and towns had more opportunities for social interaction at markets, festivals, communal work, and church gatherings. They could meet, get to know each other, and develop affections. While parental approval was still crucial, it was more likely that a match would be proposed between two young people who had already shown some interest in each other. Evidence from court records and village customs suggests that handfasting or pre-contract agreements were common, where a couple would pledge themselves to each other before a formal church wedding. These agreements, though sometimes informal, were often considered binding in the eyes of the community. This practice implies a greater degree of individual choice and mutual agreement than the term forced marriage typically suggests. If a young woman and man were truly against a union, they might attempt to find ways around parental objections, including elopement, though this carried significant social and economic risks. Furthermore, economic factors often gave commoner women a surprising degree of indirect influence over their marriages. A woman who was skilled in a craft, had property, or contributed significantly to the family's income was a more valuable asset in a marriage. Her preferences, therefore, might carry more weight in the family's decision-making process. For example, a prosperous artisan's daughter might have more say in her match than a landless peasant girl. The widows, who were often economically independent, had even more freedom in choosing a second or third husband. They were not bound by the same dynastic pressures as young noblewomen, and could choose a partner based on personal preference, companionship, or the needs of their business. Historical records are replete with examples of widows remarrying for various reasons, often making their own choices. The blanket statement that all medieval marriages were forced overlooks the vast differences in social class, regional customs, and individual circumstances. While many noblewomen experienced significant pressure and lacked true freedom in their marriage choices, the lives of peasant and urban women often contain more scope for personal agency and mutual consent, even if within a framework of parental approval and economic necessity. The idea of forced marriage, therefore, is a simplified label that fails to capture the diverse realities and the sometimes surprising degrees of choice available to women in medieval marriage. Number 1. The belief that medieval women were merely powerless possessions is a story that history itself disputes. The common understanding of medieval women often casts them as voiceless, subservient figures, treated as mere property of their fathers or husbands, devoid of any legal rights, social standing, or personal agency. This pervasive belief suggests a universal state of powerlessness, where a woman's existence was entirely defined by the men in her life, and she possessed no means to influence her own destiny or the world around her. However, historical evidence from various social strata and regions of medieval Europe strongly disputes this oversimplified narrative. The idea that medieval women were merely powerless possessions is a story that history itself thoroughly contradicts, revealing instead a complex mosaic of influence, legal standing, and societal contributions. While it is true that medieval society was largely patriarchal and women often faced legal disadvantages compared to men, they were far from universally powerless or without property. Legal codes, such as dower rights, ensured that a widow was entitled to a portion of her deceased husband's estate, typically one-third of his land and property for her lifetime. This provision was designed to ensure her economic stability and prevent her from falling into destitution. A dower was her property, and she had the right to manage it, cultivate it, and receive income from it. This significant economic right gave widows a powerful degree of independence and control over substantial assets, allowing them to support themselves, their children, and sometimes even engage in business ventures. Beyond dower, women could also inherit property in their own right, especially in the absence of male heirs or through specific legal arrangements. While primogeniture inheritance by the eldest son was common, it was not universal, and daughters could, and often did, inherit land, titles, and wealth. A woman who inherited an estate became its lady, responsible for its management, the collection of rents, and the administration of justice on her lands. She would oversee agricultural production, manage household staff, and even potentially command the allegiance of vassals. These responsibilities demonstrate a level of administrative and economic power that directly challenges the notion of powerless property. Consider the formidable examples of medieval queens and noblewomen who wielded immense political power. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a 12th century queen of France and later England, was one of the most powerful women of her age. She brought vast territories to her marriages, commanded her own court, patronized artists and poets, and even led armies. Her political acumen and influence were undeniable. Similarly, Blanche of Castile, regent of France for her young son Louis IX, effectively governed the kingdom during a tumultuous period, successfully suppressing baronial rebellions and securing her son's throne. These women were not mere ceremonial figures. They were active political players who shaped the course of nations. Their power stemmed not just from their husbands' positions, but often from their own inheritance, intelligence, and strategic capabilities. In urban areas, women played crucial roles in the economy and society. As mentioned previously, many women were involved in trades, ran businesses, and were active in guilds. They were brewers, bakers, textile workers, and shopkeepers. A woman running an alehouse, for example, made independent economic decisions, managed employees, and engaged with customers, all requiring a degree of authority and autonomy. These women were not merely appendages to their husbands, they were often vital partners in family enterprises or independent business owners, contributing directly to their household's wealth and holding respected positions within their communities. The very existence of women signing contracts, appearing in court records to sue or be sued, and making wills shows their legal personhood and agency. Even within the domestic sphere, women held significant power. The lady of the house, whether noble or commoner, was typically responsible for the management of the household, which in medieval times was often a complex economic and social unit. She oversaw servants, managed food supplies, produced clothing, and directed household finances. In larger households, this meant managing dozens, if not hundreds, of people and resources, a role that required considerable organizational skill, authority, and influence. Her decisions directly impacted the well-being and productivity of the entire household. Furthermore, medieval women often exerted influence through informal channels. They were advisors to their husbands, mothers who shaped their children's futures, and respected elders who held sway within their families and communities. While not always codified in law, this social influence was a very real form of power, allowing them to impact decisions and shape opinions. They served as custodians of family honor, transmitters of culture, and pillars of social stability. The stereotype of universal powerlessness also overlooks the spiritual power many women held within the church. Abbesses of powerful convents like Hildegard of Bingen commanded significant spiritual, intellectual, and even temporal authority. They governed large monastic communities, managed extensive lands, acted as spiritual advisors to kings and popes, and produced influential theological and philosophical works. These women were leaders in every sense of the word, demonstrating profound agency and influence beyond the traditional secular male sphere. So, while medieval women certainly faced challenges and constraints, historical evidence shows a far more complex and dynamic reality than the simple label of powerless possessions. From queens wielding political authority and noble women managing vast estates, to urban women running thriving businesses and widows independently controlling their wealth, medieval women found and exercised various forms of power and influence. Their roles were diverse, their contributions essential, and their agency, though sometimes limited, was a significant force in medieval society, directly challenging the outdated belief that strips them of all personal and societal impact.